The promise, I totally believe in sort of best practices that are empirically driven. I've seen enough examples where we know what the patterns are, and that doesn't lead to the political will to do it, to be frustrated, and to know that we need something else. So I think that Du Bois was onto this with this benevolent despot. It's like, you might be able to change someone's mind, someone might rationally accept, but how do you change hearts? Like, how do you really start to move the needle on empathy? And how, we know how to maximize efficiency. We know how to maximize revenues, right? If Uber ran, the city government, it would be a different kind of government. But in terms of, really maximizing equity, what would that look like? I think it's a challenging proposition. And I think this is a safe enough audience to say this. Let's take the example of the soda tax. All the research in the world can document that soda is a leading contributor to diabetes and health disparities and racial health disparities in diabetes and obesity. Right? We can tweak the numbers, to figure out exactly where do the revenues start to dip down because people are no longer drinking soda, whereas we want to maximize the revenues for preschool and education. Right? We can play with these numbers all day long. But we know the real battle is it a grocery tax that's going to take some kid's daddy's job away because he distributes soda to small, corner stores? Or is it about the viability of our public schools and preschool? And we know that ultimately there's millions of dollars that are getting poured into this lobby, and it's not about fighting over the empirical data about does soda cause diabetes and does it lead to health disparities. It's this moral battle, and I think the panel before talked about narratives, using. So I think ultimately we want to do great data analysis, but at the end of the day, we're really thinking about stories, and we need individuals who can stand up and sort of be that face and be that spokesperson. And I think ultimately it's a social movement. How do you use big data to lead a social movement? And I just leave sort of one last example. Nancy Krieger from Harvard, some of you may know, is an amazing public health researcher, and she's done some wonderful work about thinking about how racial discrimination leads to health disparities, and particularly this idea of embodiment, that people sort of embody their environment, and that leads to health disparities. And she's thinking about new ways about measuring segregation and thinking about the impact of Jim Crow. I mean, some pretty profound stuff. And I said to her the other day, I said, so could you, with all of that work and all that data, put a dollar value on if we were going to have reparations, what it would be? And I think the answer is you could, but the real battle is having people in their hearts to understand what racism has meant in this country. And so that's, I think, big data might be able to put a dollar value on that, but I think in terms of the real battle about changing hearts and getting people to accept, and some of that is really understanding the mechanisms and the causal process, which, the algorithms aren't necessarily great at. So I'm not entirely cynical about this endeavor around big data and analytics. I make a living really sort of promoting it and teaching people some of the skills, but I think, the mixed methods approach, the storytelling approach, and the social movement are all really critical to fulfilling this promise.
Before I open it up to questions from the audience, so whether we're talking about big data as Big Brother or renaming Big Brother Santa. So as much as I am excited and energized and really love the way that we're using big data, both to look back to inform us of where we've been, but also to inform us as to the best way to make informed policy. When we get to the predictive part, that's when I get a little nervous. Because I'm wondering, where's the humanity? So using tools, using big data, using that to push the social agenda that we identify that we want is I'm all for that. I've got to say, though, when we get to the point where we're replacing human judgment with machine learning, I don't feel better. So, but Jonathan, so when we're talking about your sort of utopic view of where we could go and a better future, what do you do when the data going in is inaccurate or flawed?
Well, it's garbage in, garbage out, so you have to inspect these data models and make sure that the training set, as they say, is an appropriate training set. And I think if you're going to criticize a predictive analytics model, you should criticize it on its own terms, not just say, oh, I don't like that data stuff, or, oh, you think algorithms rule the world. They don't. I think the answer is to point out, well, you need to have this variable in your model, and when you include that variable, you find that the model no longer predicts the future any better than guessing. And so then the data analyst has to go back to square one and find a better model. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that that's often the answer with these predictive analytics things, is that we just don't have the data to predict anything. It's the null result. We don't know. But when we do have these sort of all-knowing statistical models in the future, I mean, I don't know that I would be uncomfortable with, a computer versus human judgment. I think we should test the human judgment. Like, is the human judgment better or worse than the computer? I was sort of thinking of an example of somebody comes in to apply for a job, and it's a 19-year-old African-American male with saggy pants, and he comes in 10 minutes late. And, the interviewer looks at the data and says, wow, you have really great scores on all these things. Here's a job paying $80,000 a year. Whereas, the human judgment might say, oh, whoa, it's somebody with saggy pants who came in 10 minutes late. Maybe I don't want to trust this person. Now, what's the better result there? And we can look at the future to see, how did it go? What happened when you gave that person the job offer? And, what kind of world do you want to live in? One of them might be better. Who knows?
Yeah, I think it's right to be cautious about the use of machine learning and predictive analytics, but our charge is to make sure that we're doing it for the public good. There's an example from New Orleans. They're doing a lot of experimenting now with predictive analytics, and they merged data sets of a couple of different layers of demographics, but also fire incidents. And what they were able to do was to predict where the likely next fires will happen in their city. And so they targeted their outreach programs of free smoke detectors in homes in those neighborhoods that are most likely to have a fire. And they did that. They flooded the neighborhoods that needed it. And then there was a fire, but the family got out. And that's a story, back to your storytelling, that rarely gets told. The data did right, and the city did right, and the family was saved as a result. But that's a really positive use of data and predictive analytics for the public good. So I agree with you. We're right to be cautious, and we should. We should be vigilant and make sure that it's being used in the right way and with correct data. But I also, I wouldn't cast it aside as a method for potential public good.
Absolutely. Jonathan, you said we should test the human judgment. I think we should also test the algorithmic judgment, too. So.
Well, that's part of the process.
Do you have anything?
Oh, well, I mean, I would just say, I think this, this note of humility, knowing that the data are imperfect and constantly scrutinizing that, and knowing that, we always have more to learn about the analytics. And I think, anyone who's doing this work, needs a strong foundation in ethics and data ethics. And I think that one thing that you need about Du Bois and his maps is he has, it's all very impersonal in many ways, but then he really gives tribute to sort of the individual people who he studied and who are represented in his individual sort of maps, that those are human beings with a story. And I think it's, it's easy to sort of forget that, but that's a simple way of thinking about ethics, but that needs to be wrapped up in any kind of training with us.
Well, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I have this remote mic and going to take a question from the audience.
Hi. So going back to a subject that came up in the first session about the cities receiving the MacArthur grant to cut the jail population and dealing with this large pretrial population, and developing and using machine learning to figure out who can safely be released while they await trial and who should stay in jail. How does the public, and I'm asking this as a journalist, how does the public know that the right data is going into that machine learning model in order to make these decisions?
Well, I don't really know the answer, but I think it doesn't really matter what data goes into these models, because if it's not helpful, if it doesn't predict things, it'll just get spat out. But I guess and the right data could mean a moral judgment about, maybe some data shouldn't be used and shouldn't be factored in, and that's a form of sort of cooking the books, I guess. I don't know. And maybe you don't want to do that. You just want to throw all the data in and see what comes out, because what comes out might be the truth, and you might improve the accuracy of your predictive model by putting in that data.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know about the right data, but right now it's the available data, and then you can think about layering on additional data as it comes in. I mean, I think what's great about Philly is that, great and not great, we're not a first mover here. There are other jurisdictions that have done this, and so you can learn from their model as well about, what are, at least to what we know today, the right predictive components of where it makes sense to release versus not, and you build off of that.
I think any of these systems need to have accountability, and some of that is making it clear what data are being used and allowing other folks, particularly journalists, to take a crack at looking at that, and not if, heaven forbid, when somebody who's released does commit a crime, a violent crime, like having a system of accountability that doesn't say, oh, well, but the computer did this out. Just someone, a public official is going to stand up and say, okay, we made this decision based on the best available data. We stand by this. But I think it will take journalists to, front page of the newspaper to make sure that folks are doing this with care.
Well, a question came up during the first panel about the predictive analytics that might be used in a court case, and then the attorney would want to say, well, okay, how does your analytics model work? And they'll say, oh no, it's proprietary. Maybe I'm just trying to be devil's advocate here, but I actually think they have a pretty good argument about keeping that confidential. I mean, I'm an open source guy. I would love it if we required all that stuff to be open source so we could look at the source code. But the point of statistics is that you can test these models. It might be a black box that you can't get into because of proprietary reasons, but the point is you test what its error rate is. You can have data from the past that you can use to test it and evaluate its error rate. If its error rate is 0.0001, it doesn't really matter what the source code of the system is. I think that's a pretty valid argument. Anyway, go on.
Hi, my question goes back to the lady that spoke about the mortgages and the foreclosures and Amy.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, how can the mapping and all of this analytics go back to, there again, the banks and how they were discriminatory to certain urban cities and certain communities around the country, and how that relates back to the, putting that dollar figure amount and federal lawsuits into play to create some wealth redistribution.
I certainly don't have a simple answer to that, big question. But there's a whole bunch of people around the city who have, these amazing archives. We know so we can pull this together. There's actually, because we're going to be this, I'm trying to remember the World Heritage City. There's a movement, sort of among this sort of digital history collection folks, which includes me, to sort of put our resources together. And I think, it's really important to our identity as a city to understand how we got the patterns that we have and how the city was built and what the labor force was, and I had one professor once caution me. He's like, "Well, don't make your dissertation, which was on Redline, just about the blame discourse." But I think it's so much more important than that, this idea of sort of understanding how this city got to be the way that it is, because it's critical to understanding what we're going to do. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit different than sort of some of the predictive analytics that Jonathan's talking about, sort of looking forward and making good decisions, but to digitize some of the historical data to really understand these patterns and develop a narrative that's different than the narrative of the American dream of, like, I earned my way through school and bought my house in the suburbs and deserve everything I have, as opposed to, some of the reality of why Philadelphia public schools are failing, which is part of a much bigger regional, national picture. That's a really good use of data. I think it'll take a lot of time, but I'd love to see us use some of the historical data to really tell that story. Yeah.
And we're a model city in a lot of respects. We have an organization in the city called the Reinvestment Fund, which has a bunch of GIS people on staff, statisticians on staff, and they work with lawyers who are bringing lawsuits for disparate impact against mortgage companies and others. And so they combine the experts of the Reinvestment Fund, as sort of expert witnesses for the lawyers who are bringing this case. And so they're using some advanced statistical techniques to find the evidence of the discrimination in the kind of loans that the banks were giving out. So a lot of work is being done in that area in the city.
There's also a recent development that I think is worth watching, which is some of the banks are now setting up their own institutes to analyze the data that they have, their own proprietary data. I know that J.P. Morgan Chase has a J.P. Morgan Chase Institute, and part of what they do is they bring researchers to come and help them analyze their own proprietary information, but for the broader public good, which I find curious. I don't know.
Everybody got their own agenda, though.
Right. Well,
Is their agenda to operate on the behalf of everyone as a citizen, or is it just, they're only looking out just for the banks and the banks' interest? They're not there to look out for the poor or for those who worked all their lives, purchased their home, and then all of a sudden a situation happens. Well, where was the lawyer then to help save the day?
yeah, and so I think I think it's worth watching. What is the evolution of this and other entities like this? What are the findings that they do, and what do they do with those findings as a result? Because there's a lot of power that sits right there, and I don't know in what direction it'll go, but I think it's an interesting development.
I just want to follow up on the story that was told in the first panel about the Bloomberg story about Google or about Amazon, and it wasn't offering free shipping to certain zip codes, and those zip codes happen to be African American. I forget if you mentioned, but as a result of that story, in Boston and Chicago and New York, politicians put pressure on Google, and Google immediately said, okay, fine, I'll offer the free shipping in those areas. Now, they didn't have to. It wasn't necessarily in their economic interest, but it's one of the ways that we can just use the existence of data to successfully put pressure on corporations to remedy the disparate impacts that may not have even been intentional. Yeah, sorry, it's Amazon. Yeah.
Okay, I have the next 3 questions in line, but I see it. Raise your hand if you have a question, so I can track you. Okay, all right.
Sure. So, in looking into the future, do you see where the algorithms could advocate for people independently of them either requesting it or knowing they need it? Like, it can be predictive that you're going to need foreclosure assistance or need exoneration. Like, you get arrested, it knows 10 years out it's going to do this for you. Like, to counteract the other maybe the for-profit algorithms that are trying to take advantage of you, opposing algorithms like David size to fight that back.
Yeah, to the extent that the data exist in open format, they can be used to identify people who are most at risk, and then reach out to them for the assistance that they need. One of the ways that we use our data is to design outreach. So we collect all the information from the courts and other sources, and then we give outreach lists to local CDCs and NACs, and they go knocking on doors saying, it looks like you're going through foreclosure. Here's some sources of assistance. And I've also used the data that I have, most of which is public, to develop a statistical model that predicts, what are your chances of losing your house to foreclosure. And the interesting thing is it spits out a probability. And so we could concentrate resources on, who are the people predicted by the model to be at the highest risk of losing their homes, and what could we do to intervene. And so the other way we could use the information is to combat the law firms that file lawsuits via computer program and set up systems where the homeowners could actually use computer programs to answer those lawsuits and produce the necessary legal documents automatically. And then, the downside is that it might clog up the courts, and the courts might not be very happy with us for doing that. But it is a way to sort of fight fire with fire.
I actually have some questions from the people watching the live stream. The first is a law student from NYU, her name is Aditi, asked, she's interested in criminal justice reform, and they have barriers to collecting data on indigent defense because of different systems of delivery. So how do we get better data on that?
Different systems of, there's always going to be different systems of delivery. One of the things that happens in the criminal justice world is that local individual police departments or service providers provide data to an aggregator that then puts it into a common format so that you can have things like the FBI criminal statistics in an apples-to-apples format, and you can compare jurisdictions. But yeah, there's always going to be data problems because we're not a top-down country. We let localities do the things that they do, and sometimes that's for good because they can do things that are appropriate for their particular jurisdiction. But it does create a lot of data problems if you're trying to get a handle on things. The good thing in Pennsylvania is that Philadelphia and Pittsburgh do things differently, and then everybody else often does things the same. So you only have 3 different problems to deal with. So sometimes you can get around it that way.
And to go back to something that you said earlier and challenge the notion that statistics would bear out the validity of a model. Because if you have a situation where you're using predictive models to exclude people from selection, then you don't have an opportunity to test whether or not they could have been viable job candidates or a viable candidate for a mortgage. You can't test whether or not they would have been a proper candidate. So it goes back to what you said with garbage in, garbage out, bias in, bias out, history in, history out. And so it's not, as simple as just applying statistics on the back end.
Well, I wouldn't assume that we're predicting one thing using evidence about the same thing. Like, we're not necessarily using information about behavior on a mortgage to predict behavior on a mortgage. We could find that, behavior on some other type of bill, predicts success on a mortgage. So people wouldn't have to, even if everybody was denied the opportunity to get a mortgage, we could use big data from other parts of their life where they've been punctual and reliable to predict their success on a mortgage. So one of the ways to address your problem is to insist on having a variable in the model to account for that fact, and then the model kind of falls apart and can't predict anything. But the other way is to just see whether the model might get around it. I realize that's a very complicated answer. It kind of sounds circular, but I think that there are problems with that, and that's why it's important to scrutinize the garbage in, garbage out question.
So I'm a lawyer at Community Legal Services and up in North Philly. And I guess my sort of question for you, back when you were doing policy, sort of political policy, city work, because one of the things that we face at Community Legal Services is so hundreds of people come to us every week asking for legal help, and we couldn't possibly provide full legal representation. So what we typically do is provide full legal representation to some, but for many, they just get advice, right, about this is how you could handle the problem on your own. There are data that suggest that the advice model, many people don't follow the advice. And you could extrapolate that it's a waste of time, that providing advice doesn't doesn't achieve, quote, achieve anything, right? So I fear sometimes that in this sort of like, as we move into the future where all of our decisions, are sort of like have to be based on data. Funders ask, what is the data for that? And sort of in our sort of like, as a manager, I think, what's the data that supports that decision or not? That if we truly, at Community Legal Services, were to follow the data, it might suggest that we not provide advice, but rather just turn people away at the door instead. And it's the long-winded way of saying, have you been in a situation where you see the data and you say, you know what, screw the data. It feels better, to provide people with the advice. They want the advice, and I'm not going to pay attention to what the data says.
No, I think that's a great point and a great way to talk about it, because when I was first introducing the work of Results for America, what I say is that data and evidence should be one of the primary factors in making decisions, but certainly not the only factor in making a decision. So context matters a lot. Human experience matters a lot. Politics sometimes matters, sometimes a lot. But all of these things get layered on top of each other. The problem for me is when there's an absence of data, there's a vacuum of data, and it's just based on anecdote, it's just based on the guy next door or, whatever we did last year, rather than any sense of what the actual impact can be. And the other thing I would say about the research and the data questions that come from funders or others, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of data. Not all of it is necessarily good. So there's, the gold standard of a rigorous controlled trial, which is really hard to do and really expensive and can take a lot of time. And maybe that will help us get to a better answer sometimes. And maybe it would tell us that advice can be helpful in certain circumstances for certain people. I don't know because I haven't done the analysis, but I think, just making a curt decision based on data alone is short-sighted, and it's also worth knowing kind of what is the quality of the data.
I really like that. I really like that answer. But I also say, one of the challenges with that is, what's your outcome variable? What's your dependent variable, right? I mean, you get really small-minded, you can say, okay, whether people follow the advice or not, maybe that's what matters to you, right? Or whether they successfully resolve this legal issue, right, and maintain their house. But, if the long term is having someone feel heard, I mean, I don't have to tell you this, right? Having someone feel empowered, not to completely give up and assume that the world doesn't care about them, and these other softer, and I'm not unsympathetic to funders who want hard numbers, outcomes, and impacts, but at some level, these other things that really matter are hard to measure, but we know they matter.
Okay, we have another one from the live stream too. Donald Davis would like to know, how do we educate the poor, which might include the uneducated and mentally ill, that the inclusion of their data is important?
I think back to the storytelling piece, when we can give examples of how this is beneficial to the poor or to the mentally ill or to other vulnerable populations, that's where we're able to kind of build a case for the data. The other piece is this data in many cases is already being collected. So it's a matter of making sure that we are doing right by the data and maintaining the privacy protections that are statutorily required rather than just doing as we wish with it.
Yeah. And there's a long, sad history with researchers in terms of manipulating samples. So either excluding vulnerable populations, there's a lot of medical research that's done on white men, and that only generalizes so much. But there's also research, that exploits some of the more vulnerable communities. So I think again, there's sort of this ethical foundation for this work is really important.
I think another way that we can help low-income communities understand the importance of the data is by making sure that when we collect all this data, we make it available to ordinary individuals, not just by putting it up on Open Data Philly in the form of CSVs and APIs, but build a simple app for them where they can put in their address and then see stuff in their neighborhood, things that relate to them. Because the data's there, and they're actually really interested in it. They don't have the tech skills to be able to work with the Excel spreadsheets, but a lot of these hackathons can create these very simple apps Then it's a question of making sure that people are aware of those apps. And I think CDCs and NACs in Philadelphia at least are a good way to start feeding that information back down to the community.
3 minutes are remaining. I see 2 last questions, and then unfortunately we'll have to bring it to a close. Quick.
Thanks. Well, I was going to comment to Michael, who's left. I want to talk about
starts to feel less and less within their reach.
I'm going to have to limit you guys to a 1-sentence answer each because we're already at 5:30. Fortunately, we have a reception to look forward to, and the conversation can continue, but why don't you take it?
Well, okay, in one sentence, the thing I worry about is a dystopian future where people feel enslaved to the algorithms that predict their behavior, and all they do is work to please some